Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be with you here today virtually to share an outline and some early findings from my project titled Beyond Ignorance and EDI, Critiquing LIS Accounts of Islamophobia. And with the time I have with you today, I hope to illustrate how the field currently frames Islamophobia while also providing an alternative lens for understanding it within and related to libraries. And this alternative lens will hopefully assert and advocate for a structural critique of Islamophobia and racialized violence in general when locating and understanding race and power. And I don't think I could have such a conversation about race and power if I didn't foreground this talk by acknowledging that I'm currently calling you all from the historic homeland and unceded territory of the Tongva, Kizh, and Chumash peoples, upon which the UCLA library where I work is also located. Public and land grant institutions across the United States, including the University of California Library, or University of California system, were built on stolen land through the Morrill Act of 1862, which enabled Indigenous land to be stolen and sold for university campus construction. That universities and colleges across Canada and the United States are predicated on the violent displacement of the original stewards of this land is something that I'll come back to during this talk, particularly as I consider the ways in which regimes of power get reconstituted within and related to universities and libraries. I'll specifically be grappling with those realities by way of exploring Islamophobia and how it relates to the library world. And one of the central questions that is driving this project, which I'll spend the majority of my time with you today exploring, is to what degree does the field of library and information studies, acknowledge and recognize Islamophobia, and in what ways is it framed? In other words, how does our field explain what Islamophobia is, and how is that framing reflected in our attempts to grapple with it? And before I get into my own observations, I thought I'd share some real world examples of library writing and communication about Islamophobia to demonstrate some of the impetus for what led me to this question. So this is a screenshot from American Libraries magazine. This article was published last September as part of a special report on the legacy of 9/11 and how it impacted the library world. This particular article, titled Understanding the Other, attributes the uptick of hate crimes directed at those perceived to be Muslim or Arab as a result of ignorance, trauma induced by the attack, and bigotry. The article goes on to elaborate how, quote, some librarians experience discrimination or witness bigotry in their communities, and many work to fight ignorance with information. So witness bigotry in their communities, work to fight ignorance with information. Here's another example. An ALA member news post from 2018 highlights the benefits of using, quote, positive stories about Muslims to foster a so-called multicultural understanding. The post, similarly to the previous example, attributes Islamophobia to ignorance and bigotry, noting one of the many root causes of Islamophobia is ignorance, often fueled by stereotyped and negative portrayals of Muslims in media or popular culture. And what this example and the one I highlighted in the previous slide demonstrate is a prevailing assumption in the library world that it asserts that Islamophobia is caused by personal feelings of bigotry, hatred, or ignorance on the part of individuals, rather than an outcome of regimes of power and structures of oppression. And before I move on and explain what exactly I mean by that, I want to pause here and say that my goal is not to single out these particular pieces of writing or their authors, but rather to situate them within the broader terrain of liberal EDI discourse on Islamophobia within and related to libraries, and also employ them as evidence to demonstrate that broader trend. And within that broader trend, Islamophobia as it relates to and within libraries is reduced to hatred and ignorance on the part of individuals, rather than understood as an essential component or functioning of racial capitalism. And this is by no means exclusive to Islamophobia, but rather characteristic of how the library world tends to view and treat racialized violence in general. In libraries, we fail to recognize that processes of racialization and capitalism are inseparable, and that racial violence is not an incidental or accidental outcome, but rather, to paraphrase Dr. Robin D.G. Kelly, a sustaining constitutive component of capitalism. Yet the application of liberal anti-racism and the framework of EDI is not only ill-equipped to interrogate the relationship between race and power, but may inadvertently uphold and sustain the very violences it seeks to address, which I'll elaborate on in a moment. So hopefully you all had a chance to attend David James Hudson's keynote this morning, where these points were discussed in greater length. But essentially the EDI paradigm in libraries and LIS is currently the, quote, dominant conceptual framework through which library and information studies addresses questions of racialized power and difference. Within this modality, EDI is chiefly concerned with the politics of representation, attributing racism as merely being a problem of homogeneity or spaces not being demographically diverse. In this rendering of racism, the end goal of racial justice is rooted in inclusion within current regimes of power and subordination, and thus does not question or challenge these structures themselves, nor our relationship to them as a profession. In addition to being unable to recognize and reckon with the structural nature of racism, others like Mara Seale have pointed out that the EDI paradigm, quote, relies upon liberalism in regard to power and conflict, subjectivity and equality, and capitalism. This reliance results in a vision of librarianship that is completely decoupled from political, economic, social, and historical contexts. And this decontextualized post-political ahistorical discourse characteristic of EDI and LIS positions libraries as existing in a vacuum, independent from the discursive and material conditions of our society, which are structured around regimes of power and domination, including white supremacy. In other words, libraries don't get to be removed from the world. The problems of the EDI paradigm are well addressed in the growing body of structural critique within our field that highlights the ways in which it is deeply limited as a modality for understanding racial violence, as well as the relationship between race and power. Even those EDI or diversity discourses that attempt to grapple with racial difference and violence beyond the level of individuals, you often hear the term like systemic racism being used within these efforts with no clear precision about what is meant by systemic or what systems they are referring to. And even in those cases, they are still primarily concerned with diversification within current systems and structures as an end goal, and thus do not present an alternative vision that challenges those systems. And because of its failure to recognize and interrogate systems and structures as the cause of racialized oppression and violence, the politics of EDI signals a set of assumptions that presume that these structures fundamentally work. And thus, instances of racial violence that happen within them are treated as just that, instances, moments within something that is otherwise fine or good, but maybe has gone awry in some aspects. And as a result, EDI implicitly validates and upholds the existing status quo and does not question structures as being inherently oppressive by design and merely attempts to diversify them. The irony of this approach is that it can end up propping up and sustaining the very violences it claims to oppose. And that's a really challenging outcome to reckon with, especially because the intentions of those initiatives are generally good. But as this oft-quoted passage from Dr. Jody Melamed demonstrates, we often associate racial capitalism with the central features of white supremacist capitalist development, including slavery, colonialism, genocide, incarceration regimes, migrant exploitation, and contemporary racial warfare. Yet we also increasingly recognize that contemporary racial capitalism deploys liberal and multicultural terms of inclusion to value and devalue forms of humanity differentially to fit the needs of reigning state capital orders. Thus, liberal and multicultural terms of inclusion are deployed by racial capitalism and its accompanying institutions as a means of sustaining itself, while also decentering and repelling accountability regarding its ongoing oppressions. Dr. Sandy Grande, a professor of political science and Native American and Indigenous studies, expands on this, noting that liberal EDI projects grew in popularity in the 1980s, quote, as a means of managing the legacies of political violences for victims and perpetrators living together in the same society, thereby repelling accountability and pacifying more radical calls for liberation from these structures. Libraries in their deployment of EDI then can also perpetuate this by actively omitting or refusing to acknowledge racial violence as a sustaining feature of the racial capitalist order. Now, regarding Islamophobia in particular, when we employ the framework of EDI as a means of understanding it within libraries, how we locate it, address it, as I've mentioned, it gets reduced to personal moral failings resulting from individual hatred or bigotry on the part of, quote, bad actors, or those who are merely lacking information and are thus ignorant. In this account of Islamophobia, hatred and ignorance are treated as its root cause rather than one of its many outcomes, and thus cannot be interrogated as a form of structural oppression and racial domination. And it tends to be that our acknowledgement of Islamophobia is typically situated vis-a-vis its threat to our supposed cultural values as a profession, including so-called multiculturalism if you're in Canada, or perhaps democracy if you're in the United States, as though those values themselves are not often deployed as a means of pacifying calls for liberation. But maybe that's a discussion for a different talk. But anyway, when Islamophobia within LIS is understood in this way, as incidental individual acts of moral transgressions and lack of knowledge, then there's also something that is simultaneously being communicated about the places in which it takes place, those places being libraries. So when Islamophobia is understood as being caused by individual actions or feelings, then its existence within libraries is seen as incidental in an otherwise functional, good, or at least neutral system that is not itself deeply rooted within Islamophobia. This leaves libraries' structural entanglements with and within regimes of power unquestioned, and even positions them as being outside of these structures altogether. In other words, libraries are treated as completely removed from those regimes of power that structure our society, and thus racial violence that takes place in and related to them are seen as isolated instances, and thus addressing it is approached in the same way that one might weed a garden. But we know that this prevailing assumption that libraries are intrinsically good or neutral or wholly removed from structures of oppression is deeply untrue. As outlined by Fobazi Ettar in her essential outlining of the concept vocational awe, the apolitical mythologizing of libraries as inherently good or sacred and thus beyond critique is not only wrong, but also sees them as independent from the fabric of the societies that produce them. And this apolitical reading positions libraries then removed from Islamophobia and process of racial domination, making them seen as well positioned to combat it. And this line of thinking is reflected in the activities employed by the EDI paradigm within our profession, which regard diversity training, reading lists and groups as an end goal in preparing our workforce to combat racism as we see it in achieving racial justice, while simultaneously overlooking libraries' role in the larger architecture of racial capitalism. And to be clear, I'm not saying that those activities, such as trainings or reading lists, are necessarily or inherently bad or without positive potential impacts, but I do question the underlying set of assumptions beneath those initiatives and what they say about libraries, that we can simply unlearn and relearn things in order for us not to be racist as an end goal in achieving racial justice. What both of these accounts you see here on the slide lack in terms of both libraries and both Islamophobia in LIS is, as I keep reiterating, structural critiques of how libraries and LIS are deeply entangled with and within regimes of power and oppression that are always being reconstituted and are functionally dependent on racialized violence. And this is sort of the space where my project is situated. I hope to extend the growing and crucial body of structural critique within our field and advocate for a reconfiguration and new understanding such that Islamophobia and racialized violence more broadly is understood as constitutive of racial capitalism within which libraries are deeply entangled, despite common misconceptions within and outside of the library world that deem us removed from them. And in this reconfiguration and recontextualization of Islamophobia, one which employs a structural lens for understanding race and power, what Islamophobia is, how it exists in the world, how it is sustained, and how to grapple with it becomes clearer. This reframing underscores and recontextualizes Islamophobia as a form of racial violence and rejects the tendency to reduce it as a problem of religious discrimination or individual ignorance. There is, of course, even a problem with referring to oppression against those understood to be Muslim as a quote phobia, given that the use of that word signals a discrimination rooted in the personal biases of particular individuals. For this reason, many may elect instead to use terms like anti-Muslim racism. But in the case of either term, which should not be obscured or omitted, is the production of Islamophobia within racial capitalism, the intersection of race and religion in the context of Western empire building and statecraft, including the war on terror, and its relationship to other structures of dominance, including white supremacy. And I do want to, point out here that in the case of academic libraries in particular, I don't think the tendency to view ourselves as independent from these regimes of domination is especially unique or independent from the wider institutions in which we are situated. There still exists a prevailing and frankly wild misconception that universities and other institutions of higher learning can and should be neutral, apolitical, or wholly removed from the structuring features of society as a whole, despite that impossibility, though again, it may admit to having a diversity problem. To once again quote Sandy Grande in her essential article, Refusing the University, she positions the university as such as an arm of the settler state, in which the logics of elimination, capital accumulation, and dispossession are always being reconstituted, reimagined, and reapplied. This configuration of the university challenges the commonly held assumption that the academy is merely exclusionary, neoliberal, Eurocentric, and patriarchal. The relationship between the university as an apparatus of oppressive regimes is underscored again by Dr. Robin D.G. Kelly in his article, Black Study, Black Struggle. And I pull an excerpt from it here on the screen. And it reads, "The fully racialized social and epistemological architecture upon which the modern university is built cannot be radically transformed by, quote, simply adding darker faces, safer spaces, better training, and a curriculum that acknowledges historical and contemporary oppressions. This is a bit like asking for more Black police officers as a strategy to curb state violence." And in the case of the Kelly quote, I really appreciate the use of the word architecture because it gestures towards like a backbone or the very fabric that constitutes these institutions. Kelly goes on in the article, which I definitely recommend, to note how universities are not walled off from the, quote, real world, but are corporate entities in their own right. And I think this really drives home the reality that their violences are not incidental, but part of a larger structural order. And in the case of Islamophobia specifically, its relationship to the university precedes the war on terror. Western universities in particular have long been employed by and within structures of racialized oppression to serve the larger political and economic goals of Western empire. For instance, as articulated by the late great Edward Said, the Western Academy has always been instrumental in enshrining Orientalism and establishing a, quote, ambiguous other to justify Western empire building and statecraft. So this is, of course, nothing new. And when the university's connectedness with and within regimes of power are understood as foundational to its functioning, then its more visible violences, for example, those that get a lot of press coverage, should not be understood as incidental, but rather as evidence of its deep structural entanglements. And this might look like, in the case of the war on terror, billions of federal dollars and the massive growth of the US intelligence community since 9/11, which have resulted in places of higher learning across the US becoming increasingly tied to the worlds of military, intelligence, and law enforcement. This also results in, as shown on the bottom left headline, universities with historically marginalized student populations from low-income regions being given massive grants from, again, US intelligence agencies to, quote, cultivate diverse cybersecurity pipelines. It could also look like faculty being praised uncritically, as shown in the middle headline here, praising researchers from McMaster for engineering tomorrow's military success. It also looks like heavily policed, militarized college campuses, and any of my UC colleagues in the audience may recognize the photograph on the top right, which is known as the UC Davis pepper spray incident, in which militarized university police pepper sprayed students at an Occupy movement demonstration at UC Davis. And it might also manifest as the silencing, policing, and marginalization of Palestinians and Palestinian activists on college campuses, as articulated by the open letter I share on the bottom right, signed by UCLA students, staff, and faculty to campus administration, which was circulated last summer. And when we're able to locate and articulate these entanglements with and within regimes of power, then Islamophobia within and related to university libraries may also similarly be understood within this context. And thus, things like librarians, in the case of the two screenshots on the left, publishing articles on how librarians can support the war on terror, or library workers being suspicious of Muslim patrons who read certain kinds of books, or Muslim students having their hijabs ripped off at the library, or having Muslim materials defaced, or having anti-Muslim poems being displayed under the guise of freedom of expression, can be understood as manifestations of our structural relationship with Islamophobia, rather than isolated instances of so-called bigotry. And I know that last example is from a public library, but the reality that it exists within and in service to broader structures or structural imperatives still applies. So in this presentation, I have hopefully laid out how I see LIS framing Islamophobia while highlighting the limitations and harms of that framing, as well as what this framing signals about how LIS does and does not understand race and power. As I move forward with this project, an area that I would like to continue to explore relates to the question I have here on the slide. That is, in what way specifically does this framing of Islamophobia signal the absence of structural critique within LIS's understanding of racialized violence more broadly? For instance, is it in the discursive absences, in other words, what LIS doesn't say, or in the language that LIS does use to describe it? In any case, I'm really grateful for this venue and having the opportunity to organize my thoughts in this way. I just want to end today with some cautions and reflections as I move forward with this project and some considerations that have surfaced for me. So foremost, I know I focused at least partially on language in this talk, namely the language LIS uses to frame Islamophobia and the underlying assumptions that underpin that wording. What I don't want to convey, however, is that this issue I am raising is just about semantics. I'm not saying go into our EDI statements, control F the words hatred, ignorance, bigotry, delete, and replace them with structural entanglements. I hope that the reframing I'm advocating for is at least a little deeper than the level of language. I'm also not advocating for better, more militant EDI. Rather, I'm considering the possibilities that might emerge if we rethink or depart from dominant paradigms of liberal racial politics altogether, especially considering the current framing is not only limited, but may also be actively harmful. I'm also interested in what possibilities are achievable when we're able to reckon with and grapple with racial violence to its fullest extent as a profession, and how advocating for a reframing of Islamophobia might lend to that. As Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore points out, to date, over $780 billion have been spent on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, while schools, hospitals, arts, and leisure go begging. And know that Canada is certainly not an exemption from that trend either. And I think the library world has only to gain from recognizing this and acknowledging how the library profession and our work is negatively impacted by societies that are structured around capitalism, imperialism, and war. So I'll leave you today with my bibliography, but first, I really just want to thank Dave, Yoonhee, Ebony, and Baharak for making space and advancing critical scholarship that keeps inspiring me, as well as David, Hannah, Maddie, and Bayan for all of your support. Thank you so much. Here is my bibliography if you're interested.